Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. Bed occupancy rates at almost 95%, 11,000 ambulances delayed over 30 minutes. Those are the latest performance statistics from NHS England. Can the health service survive many more winters like this? Crime recorded by the police in England and Wales is up, including violent crime, knife crime and sex offences. But the official crime survey suggests that crime continues to fall, so which figures are right? The Families Minister, Nadeem Zahawi, said he left the party early and the exclusive President's Club will not be holding any more events after revelations of sexual harassment at their charity function. But do women need more protection against exploitation? The government appointed Muslim women to head up a new commission for countering extremism. But why are some senior figures in the Muslim community opposing her appointment? I'll be talking to former Conservative Cabinet Minister Saeeda Warsi, who's called her a mouthpiece for ministers. All that in the next hour. And as Donald Trump and Theresa May and the world's rich and famous all converge on a ski resort in the Swiss Alps, we've managed to keep one member of the global elite captive here in Westminster. It's the Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Welcome to the programme, Peter.
Thank you,
going to be
I've never been in the global elite, thank heaven.
But it's good you're here in the studio.
Yeah.
Now, let's go straight to Davos, where Theresa May is due to address the World Economic Forum this afternoon. And our business editor, Simon Jack, is there. Simon, what do you think the Prime Minister is going to say?
Well, she's going to start by making some remarks on technology. She's going to call on the rich and powerful here to bring more pressure to bear on big tech companies to do more to remove extremist content from the internet, make the internet a safer place to do business, and ideally develop artificial intelligence, which means that this content will automatically come down by intelligence which will recognise exactly what kind of messages are going out. She's also going to say that Britain wants to be a big part of the AI development. But, you don't really get to choose your own subject in Davos. And of course, everyone will be looking forward to her meeting with Donald Trump. The Eagle has landed. He is here. He arrived in his helicopter just about an hour ago. And I think people will be looking for one thing, just how special is our special relationship, because since she rushed over to the White House about a year ago, and we saw those famous images of them holding hands in the White House, they've actually soured a little bit, those relations. They publicly clashed on Twitter over Donald Trump's tweeting of some far-right material from Britain First. There was the UK visit. Is he coming? Isn't he coming? Why isn't he coming? Is it because he didn't like Barack Obama's deal on the new US embassy, or is it because he didn't think he'd get a very warm welcome? And the other thing that's emerged here, and I can't really overemphasize this enough, is that whilst we've been here, the darling of the World Economic Forum has become Emmanuel Macron, and Donald Trump likes him. The reports are that he's going to offer Macron a state visit before he offers Theresa May the same thing. And so in that old question, when I want to speak to Europe, who do I call? Is it the UK? At the moment, that's not clear.
And as you say, you don't get to pick your own topic in Brexit, presumably, even though you don't get to pick your own topic in Davos. Presumably, although Theresa May is talking about technology, there must be a lot of chat about Brexit.
Yeah, she's going to be asked about that, how the negotiations are going. Philip Hammond was just on a panel on the main stage, and they said they think they made some pretty good progress just before December. They're hoping to get some kind of transition deal framework wrapped up by March, which would give, if that was true, businesses who are very interested in that up to 3 years. And the other question is, once we're out after March 2019, what happens then? Is Britain free to pursue its own trade deals? And of course, the big prize for some would be a trade deal with the US. Prime Minister's been speaking to the BBC in the last hour or two, and she said, we're up for it. They're up for it. There's a lot of appetite. And I have to say that some of Donald Trump's senior ministers, Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, Wilbur Ross, the Economic Secretary, have both made some positive noises that there's a lot of appetite to do that. Now, so both sides are willing. As you will know, there's quite a lot of questions about whether they're able to do that within the confines of Article 50. Now, David Davis is absolutely convinced that he's got freedom after March 2019 to negotiate with whoever he likes, with the idea that you sign on the dotted line the minute the transition period is over. So positive noises around trade. She's going to want to accentuate that. We'll be looking very much at the body language, though, between the Prime Minister and the President of the United States.
Simon Jack, thank you very much. And Peter Hitchens, you're with us for the duration of the programme to talk about all the big issues. Theresa May, there in Davos, not exactly centre stage, Simon Jack was telling us. It feels as though this is part of the kind of continuing narrative of the problems Theresa May's got.
Well, what is she doing there? Anyway, Davos was described to me as finding the worst restaurant you know, going to it on a snowy evening and sitting listening to a man talking about Bitcoin in a Peter Ustinov voice. A wholly pointless boondoggle. What is she doing there when it seems
representing
to me...
Britain, presumably, if Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron...
To whom? To lots of other people who are going on boondoggles. By the way, Theresa May can't go on a state visit to the United States because she's not head of state. Only the Queen can do that. So, whereas President Macron being head of state can be, so that can't be on offer. And as for the special relationship, I thought everybody now knew that the special relationship was a joke and a myth, and it doesn't exist. If she's looking for it in Davos, she won't find it there either. It seems to me her problems are at home.
But if she is going to meet Donald Trump, and that has been sort of hurriedly arranged for them in Davos, does she have to try and restore better relations?
Well, I don't know what you can do. The man is such a complete loose cannon that it's impossible to know what he will do next and what he would make out of any meeting at all and whether it will benefit her or not. In whose eyes is somebody standing improved by being able to meet Donald Trump? Not mine, for a start, and I can't be alone. So it's the baffling thing that happens to politicians who fail at home, is they try to prance around on international stages looking more important than they are. And it doesn't seem to me to be a wise thing to do when you have, it seems to me, yet another, how shall I put this, possible putsch against her being planned.
Now, the former Prime Minister David Cameron is also in Davos, and he has been overheard by the television cameras talking about Brexit. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
See you again, really nice. Good, actually. I'm busy doing the book, and I'm doing this fun with China, which is interesting.
Everyone is talking about Brexit.
Yes, well, I know. It's frustrating. It's, as I keep saying, it's a mistake, not a disaster. It's turned out less bad than me. It's still going to be done. How are you?
A mistake, not a disaster, is what David Cameron described Brexit as there. Of course, you were on the other side of the EU referendum for him, but are you surprised to hear him saying that?
Well, no, but then he didn't really understand what he was doing. And also, it's a bit of a Mandy Rice Davis, isn't it? He would say that, wouldn't he? Before the vote, he would have said it was a disaster. Now, it's happened, and he is quite rightly viewed by many people as responsible for it. He has to say it's a mistake. And a mistake not made by him, of course, but by the British people for voting to leave in the referendum which he himself called.
And you voted to leave. Are you?
I didn't vote.
You didn't vote?
No part in the referendum. I didn't want a referendum. I hate referenda. I think they did terrible damage to the
But you wanted Britain to leave the EU?
I want Britain to be independent, but not this way. And I think...
Because what do you make of how negotiations are going so far?
I think negotiations... I was a labour and industrial correspondent for many years in the 70s and 80s, and all negotiations end at the last minute. And it would be foolish to imagine that just because things seem to be going badly now and look difficult now that they won't reach a conclusion, because they will reach a conclusion when the last minute comes. The only question is what form the compromise will take. And
you would like Britain to stay close to the single market, possibly in the European Economic Area?
I think the Norway option is the best one for us, and I think it would satisfy several things. First of all, it would avoid the terrible consequences of becoming a third country if we left, which would be really, really difficult. These aren't tariffs; these are the huge bureaucracies at frontiers that you face if you become a third country trading with the European Union. And it would also, actually, because of the little known but important Liechtenstein option, give us a chance to control our borders as well. And we would not have to take anything...
This is what Brexiteers like Jacob Rees-Mogg describe as being a vassal state. You'd be a rule taker, not a rule maker, because you wouldn't be defining the rules of the single market, you'd just be accepting.
He can say that if he likes, but the problem is this. In 40 years of being in the European Union, much of Britain's muscle, its independent muscle, has atrophied. And we really aren't in a very strong position to march out into total independence and sovereignty at the moment. And if we try to do so, I think we might stumble. It's perfectly sensible for a politician who's making a name by being a militant on this issue to speak like this. But the trouble is there will have to be a compromise. And those of us who take the future of the country seriously, or even try to take the future of the country seriously, must wonder what sort of compromise that can be, which would suit both sides. This wasn't a huge, overwhelming vote to leave. It's a narrow one. And therefore we have to accept that there will be a compromise when it comes, which isn't exactly what anybody wants.
OK. Well, it's time for our daily quiz now. According to reports in the press, Donald Trump has told Theresa May that she could be like a world-famous politician. The question is, which one? Was it A, Winston Churchill, B, Margaret Thatcher, C, Ronald Reagan, or D, Neville Chamberlain? At the end of the programme, Peter will give us the correct answer to today's quiz. Now, this morning, the NHS England released the latest figures on the organisation's performance. In the week ending 21st of January, pressure on the service continued with 11,000 ambulance delays and over 30 minutes, ambulance delays of over 30 minutes, and bed occupancy levels of 94.8%. These figures are a very slight improvement in comparison to the previous set of weekly figures when there was a bed occupancy level of 94.9% and 12,600 ambulance delays of over 30 minutes. Labour have seized on the issue. Tonight they will hold an NHS rally outside the Houses of Parliament in support of the heroes that work there. And yesterday, at Prime Minister's questions, Jeremy Corbyn attacked the PM about NHS funding, calling the extra £2.8 billion pledged in last autumn's budget as thin gruel. Theresa May said that the NHS had been better prepared than ever before for winter pressures, and the government was ensuring that the NHS receives more funding. But she faces trouble on her own benches over the issue too. Boris Johnson reportedly called for extra NHS funding at this week's cabinet. Backbenchers Jacob Rees-Mogg, Mark Pritchard and Nick Bowles have all said that the health service needs more money. And frustration was also vented by some Tory MPs on Twitter, including Johnny Mercer and Sarah Wollaston, after the Prime Minister deflected an invitation from 90 MPs across the parties to set up a cross-party group to enhance sustainability in the NHS. Well, joining us now is Carol Jagger, who works at the Institute of Ageing in Newcastle. She's warned that we might be underestimating the future increases in the demand on the NHS. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme. You've done research which shows us that as we're living longer with more complicated conditions, our healthcare is going to get more complicated too.
Yes, I have. And if I can just say a little bit about what we did. Our model takes people aged 35 and over, and with their lifestyle factors, obesity, smoking, and physical inactivity and other factors, it simulates how they're going to age in terms of accruing diseases. And yes, we found that most of the increase will be in what we termed complex multimorbidity, numbers of disease, 4 or more diseases.
And that's more complex to manage, and it's going to cost considerably more money?
Yes, it is. But I think also it's about organisation too. It all boils down to money, but it's really, we will need better training for health professionals and longer consultation times for GPs as well.
So, I mean, we talk a lot about funding for the NHS, whether it's adequate or not, and you're warning us that we're going to look at substantial increases in the future. I mean, can the NHS really ever have enough money?
I think it has to be a longer term plan than we've got at the moment. It isn't something that we can just shore up for a couple of years. Basically, our research is showing that this is going to continue for the next 20 to 30 years, and it isn't going to get better. And actually, more worryingly, we also found that people, younger people who are ageing into the older population are coming in with more disease as well.
All right, well, Carol Jagger, thank you very much for explaining all that to us. With me now in the studio is Labour's Shadow Health Secretary Jonathan Ashworth and Tory MP Andrew Murison, who served as a medic in the Navy for 20 years. Thank you both for coming in to join us. Andrew, can I start with you? I mean, there's been a clear, sharp rising concern amongst voters about the NHS. 40% now say they think it's the most important issue facing the government. Is the government handling it well enough?
I mean, you're right. By far and away, it's the biggest issue in my constituency mailbag at the moment. I think the government has approached winter pressures, which we have had, well, for the past 30 years since I've been associated with healthcare every year, quite well this year. We've had advanced planning, we've had more money going in, and it's been handled, I think, quite well. And
that's a very short-term issue for the winter, though. I mean, the Chief Executive of the NHS England says he needs £4 billion more pounds, and he's not getting it from your government.
Well, I think he should get it, and a number of my colleagues are saying the same, notably Boris Johnson, obviously. I've been arguing for more money for the NHS for a very long time, but I think Carol Jagger is absolutely right. It's not just about the sum total of money going into the NHS, which lags well behind that of comparable countries, I have to say, in Western Europe, but it's also how we structure the NHS and what we do within the NHS. We mustn't make it just a sickness service. We must also concentrate on preventative health, which is what Carol was referring to.
The money is a part of it, though, and your manifesto pledged that there would be an increase in NHS spending in real terms per head of population for every year of this Parliament, but that's not actually how it's going to happen, is it? The National Audit Office says that once adjusted for age, the funding will actually fall in the year 2019 to 20.
Well, there's more money being spent on the NHS than ever before. More doctors, more nurses, more activity underway in the NHS.
And there's more need than ever before.
Yes, of course there is, and there's going to be even more. And Carol's remarks, I think, are deeply worrying because she's predicting actually we're undershooting, and that I think reinforces the need for in the 70th anniversary year of our National Health Service for there to be a root and branch, cross-party, I think above party discussion, consultation, commission on where we go from here.
Jonathan, you didn't sign the letter calling for a cross-party commission on the NHS. Is that because you think this is an issue that Labour does well on and you don't want to be seen to be cooperating with Conservatives on it?
No, not at all. And I'm very happy to cooperate with Andrew. And to be fair to Andrew, when he says he's been arguing for an extra £4 billion, that's absolutely right, because I sit in the debates and I listen to Andrew's contributions to those debates in the House of Commons. And Andrew's completely consistent on that point. But when it comes to it, decisions about funding for the NHS are, by their nature, political decisions. They're about choices that government makes. And I'm just very sceptical that this government would choose to make the sorts of decisions to give the NHS the funding it really needs. Historically, and we are in the 70th anniversary of the NHS, historically, for 62 years, the NHS usually got more or less a 4% uplift year by year. For the last 8 years, it's going for this very tight financial squeeze, getting around a 1% uplift, and it's just not. It just means we've got like the crisis we've seen on our TV screens and on the BBC News.
But the NHS wouldn't be getting that 4% uplift if you'd won the general election last year, because you were actually promising something more like a 2% uplift. Not that much more money actually than the government.
Well, we were promising an extra £5 billion for this year, and that would have been a substantial increase compared to the Conservatives' plans. But I absolutely agree with you. When you get to the 2020s and the 2030s. We do need a long-term plan for the National Health Service. So one of the
isn't that why you need to take the politics out of it and have some kind of cross-party commission, maybe that doesn't look at the immediate funding, but looks at the future beyond the lifetime of this government and restructuring the NHS?
Well, I think the problem is the last time we had a Royal Commission, I think it was Harold Wilson's government who set it up. And I don't think anybody really thinks it came up with any satisfactory conclusions or really put in place a long-term plan for the NHS when Harold Wilson did it in the 70s. But we do need
it couldn't be done better now.
Well, one of the proposals that we've got is to set up, we've got the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is generally is respected. People accept its recommendations and its analysis. We believe we need something like that for healthcare, to recommend to government or to give government proper independent reports on the funding needs of the NHS, the staffing needs of the NHS, to allow government to put in place that sort of long-term planning, which we do agree is needed. I just don't think a Royal Commission will get us the answers on time.
And does there need to be some kind of cross-party cooperation and the opposition get involved in looking at the long-term future of the NHS?
I really think there does need to be, and I think the public expects there to be. The report that John is referring to, I think, is Sir Alec Merison's report 30-odd years ago, which actually has been in large part implemented over the years. And it's just not right to say that because Royal Commissions in the past have taken a long time, being very expensive, they need to be in the future. We need to make sure this is within a very tight timeline. I think 2 years. To have a report that is authoritative, which is what a Royal Commission lends, and is most certainly not partisan. The public want that. You ask the public outside what they want. They want politicians to come together and agree something that is, frankly, the closest we get to a national religion in this country. If there's one thing that unites the parties in Westminster at the moment, it is the National Health Service. I promise you this, that at the next general election, it's going to be at the very forefront of people's minds.
Peter Hitchens, cross-party cooperation on the future of the NHS, is it the only way to tackle some of the really big questions that there are about funding?
Yes, I think I think we're all tired of Labour pretending that only they care about the health of the nation. I mean, many of us have our criticisms of the Conservative Party.
Just said Andrew cared about it.
It's ludicrous, yeah, but his party is constantly being accused by Labour of effectively trying to destroy it, privatise and all this. This isn't true. And the whole approach of both parties in the end becomes needlessly adversarial because they're trying to make capital out of it. We had, 18 years of marketisation and reorganisation, and then we had 13 years of splurge. And the truth is that you could spend the entire gross domestic product on the National Health Service, it would still be unsatisfactory. One of the things a Royal Commission could address is one of the points that Andrew made, is the huge need to start doing something about preventive health. The hospital near where I live, you approach it through two concentric rings. The first is a ring of people smoking, many of whom whom are hospital staff, and many of whom are patients. And then is a huge ring of car parks. Now, these are actually two huge contributions to ill health. The lack of exercise of the people who use cars far too much in a country which has ludicrously bad public transport or provision for walking and cycling. And the other is the continued insistence of people on pursuing lifestyle choices which make them ill. Somehow or other, I would personally favour tax incentives for people who keep themselves healthy and fit, for instance. Somehow or other you have to do something about that. And then there's the other final thing, which neither of you will mention, which is that for the past 50 years now, all governments have been attacking the family and trying to substitute for it with the state. The care of the old, which used to be done in families, is now almost invariably loaded onto the health service at the end of people's lives. And that's a great deal of the reason for the problems we have every winter, as everybody well knows. And I think there has to be some recognition in government that it's the destruction of the family and the dragooning, particularly of women, into paid work rather than being at home, has been actually a mistake. And we can't substitute for it, either by the health service or by the welfare system or social services.
Some pretty radical ideas
I
there
try to have
from,
them. Somebody's got to have.
Peter,
That's why I'm not in the global elite.
Is this something that government ever really could consider, ideas as radical as those that Peter is suggesting?
Me? Well, golly, I thought John was going to get it. Yeah, I like radical. I like blue skies thinking. Some of the points made I would agree with and I sympathise with. But look, I'm a politician and I'm a practical person and I want something done within a reasonable time frame. Actually, Jeremy Hunt's 10-year time frame, I very much welcome that he's announced recently, far more realistic than the 5-year thing we've been dealing with up to this point. So we do need to look long term, but we also have to work, I think, with society and what people want and expect in the 21st century. So lifestyle, absolutely important. Of course, smoking has gone down quite significantly in recent years. The great driver of health inequalities is gradually being addressed, but there are other health-related lifestyle issues, and I think particularly obesity. So it would be a mistake in any review simply to look at how to patch people up when they become sick. We also need to look at why they become sick and how government can do things that aren't going to make matters worse, because you need to remember government interventions have a habit of making things worse rather than better. And
Labour argue a great deal about the funding for the NHS, and we could pick through the numbers and show that actually even the Labour Party wasn't promising the annual 4% uplift that the NHS traditionally gets. But this goes beyond money, doesn't it? I mean, is it not a mistake to be constantly criticising the government for the funding they're giving the NHS and not looking at some of the more underlying structural issues?
Oh, absolutely. There's loads of fundamental issues we need to tackle. So I think funding is a big fundamental. We can't ignore it, as indeed is staffing. We've got vacancies for 100,000 staff. As indeed is the social care system, which is slightly separate from the NHS, but the two are interlinked because, as we've heard, there's lots of elderly people trapped in hospitals.
Yes, I would say perhaps shouldn't be as separate, social care and the health service.
But I would say driving a lot of that is the £6 billion worth of cuts, not the dragooning of women into the world of work, as Peter
Peter
described
women always
it.
work. It's when they get paid for it.
Well, I actually think women working is a good thing, and we should have equal pay for women, and more women should be encouraged into the world of work.
I didn't say anything about women having equal pay.
I don't think the problems around lack of social care provision and lack of care for our elderly is because women are in work, to be frank. And actually, Peter, if why don't some of the men stay at home then to look after these elderly relatives?
Look, fine by me if you can persuade them to do it. But if you want to take me up on that, first of all, I'm not in the least bit opposed to equal pay for equal work, and never said so. What I am opposed to is the huge pressure, mainly imposed by falling living standards, on women to go out to paid work when, in many cases, they would rather be raising their own children.
This is a significant and contentious debate, but it's a debate for another day, I'm afraid. We'll have to leave it there, gentlemen. We'll have to leave it there. Now, the Home Office has appointed a Muslim human rights campaigner, Sarah Khan, to lead a new commission to counter extremism. Labour say the appointment fails to acknowledge that most Muslims have no confidence in the government's prevent strategy, and adding to the criticism is the former Faith and Communities Minister, Baroness Varsi. I spoke to her earlier from our Leeds studio and I asked her why she thought Sarah Khan wasn't qualified for the role.
I'm sure Sarah is a perfectly, nice individual, nice human being, but this is a really vital role, Sarah. It is a role which will determine the parameters of the values that are important to Britain in 2018, and one which will determine the kind of country that our children and their children will grow up in. And for that role, there are certain characteristics that are essential in the person who leads on that role, and one of them is that this person has to be independent. They have to be somebody who can robustly challenge communities and robustly challenge government.
And why do you think Sarah Khan will not be independent?
I think there is a whole plethora of reasons, concerns about how Sarah came about, the work that she's done, the campaigns that she's run, the book that she wrote, who was it written by, how much of this has been done at the request and behest of the Home Office and agencies attached to the Home Office. And I think for me, what's really important is that whoever comes into this role comes into it from a position of strength. This is a person who's going to have to challenge communities, who is going to have to take on some of the tough issues. This person has to be deeply respected and connected to the communities in which they operate.
Well, surely your criticism of her today then is undermining that authority and going to make her job harder.
Well, I made my views clear in relation to this appointment to my colleagues many months ago. Indeed, I wrote about it and I put an extract of that out yesterday. So I've been talking about the importance of this role and how important it is that we appoint the right person. Remember, Sarah, this person is going to have some really tough conversations from a position of strength, where people who may not agree with this person will have to come along and be prepared to have that discussion. And most importantly, this is a person who will have to engage broadly and deeply with all communities. And sadly, Sarah has been an advocate of the government's policy of disengagement, which has meant that more and more people, individuals and activists, have been considered beyond the pale and have been disengaged. And so for these and a number of other reasons, it's sad that the government had an opportunity to make a very good appointment, and indeed there were some very good candidates in the final to this appointment, but they chose not to do so.
Would you have liked to have been a candidate for this? Is some of this about your disappointment that you've not been appointed to the role?
Well, I could only have been appointed if I applied for the job, and I didn't apply for the job because I didn't feel that I could give it the time that this job requires. But I do know that there were other very good people in the final, including Nazir Afzal. I mean, you'll be familiar with him because he's appeared on your programme, a prosecutor who took on the grooming gangs and took on some really tough issues and questioned and challenged both communities and officialdom. And that's the kind of person that we needed in this role, somebody independent, somebody brave, somebody experienced, somebody who carried credibility and great gravitas in this area. And sadly, that's not the route that the government chose to take.
Now, you've also been very critical of the government's anti-terrorism policy, Prevent. It's something that you've called toxic and you've said it should be paused. Is that still your view?
My view is that we definitely need something in our counter-terrorism policy which deals with people upstream who are on the pathway towards terrorism. But what is clear, and this isn't just my view, it's the view of many of the intelligence services, indeed at the highest level in the police, amongst think tanks, academics, across the political divide, where many people, including the independent reviewer, the ex-independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, David Anderson QC, who have said it is time for an independent review of Prevent. That is a view that I hold, that is a view that many practitioners on the ground who practice Prevent hold, because what they want is for Prevent to be supported by the communities in which they operate.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned David Anderson, the former reviewer of terrorism, because he's actually rather supportive of Sarah Khan's appointment and says he doesn't see how she could be a government stooge, as she was very critical in her opposition to the government's counter-terrorism bill.
And I'm sure there will be many people who you will find who will support this role, but I think I can only go by my own experience. And, you know, Sarah, I have known of Sarah and her sister Sabine, who is an official at the Home Office, for nearly 15 years. I've seen their journey over time, their views and their changing views on Islam and religiosity, their changing views about how they practice and manifest Islam, wearing the hijab, not wearing the hijab. You know, this is something that I have been engaged in over decades. And knowing what I know, having sat both on the inside of government and worked on this issue from the outside of government, I am disappointed by this appointment because I think it will hinder, not help, our fight against extremism.
You criticise this appointment as another Toby Young moment on Twitter. Does that mean you don't think that Sarah Khan will continue in this role?
I hope the government will think again. Look, it's up to the Home Secretary to make this appointment, but in the past appointments have been made, and when it becomes clear that the appointment was not the right appointment, then government has reconsidered. And I sincerely hope that government will reconsider this appointment. I mean, only this morning, Sarah, I've been speaking to people who engage in prevent work at the grassroots level, and 2 people have said to me that this appointment will actually make their life and their job more difficult. These are people who are engaged in government's own prevent work. I've had a discussion with a very senior civil servant this morning who has said that the advice was that this appointment would actually make things more difficult in the fight against extremism.
OK, we'll have to leave it there, but Baroness Farsi, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, we're joined now in the studio by Dame Louise Casey, who wrote a report for the government on community cohesion and extremism in 2016. Thank you very much for coming in. Is Sara Khan the right person for this job?
Yes, and to be fair, whoever was appointed to this job, no matter who they were, was going to face a barrage of criticism, and probably in many areas of the country, people going, thank God somebody's in the job and we're cracking on. So, I mean, I actually think some of this is incredibly unedifying. You know, if only powerful Muslim women and non-Muslim women would come together and get behind the Extremism Commission and behind Sara Khan's appointment, that would be a much better way forward. The woman hasn't even started yet. And, you know, when Baroness Farsi was appointed, she herself took some criticism from the same sort of cohort at that time. I wish she was on side and supporting and making this work, because whoever's in the job
her
is
argument
going to get criticism.
is that Sara Khan isn't able to be independent enough from government because she's been so close to the Home Office in the past. Is there any substance
I just
to
find that extraordinary, really. That, you know, Sara Khan, have her on. I mean, she's her own woman, and she will say exactly what she thinks needs to be done. She's fearless. She's fearless around politics. She's fearless around, frankly, some of the stuff she has had to put up with.
We did try and get her on today, but she wasn't available. But
I'm a poor substitute. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that it's just not right on the day. You know, a long process will have been gone through. This will have had ministerial support and commitment. I would imagine it's an appointment made very much by the Home Secretary. You know, we need to get behind this and leave aside all this personality stuff. It's not where we need to be. There's a job that needs to be done. Sara Khan's got the job. I think she'll do it really well. We should be behind her and supporting her.
Peter Hitchens?
I'm sorry, I just can't really support the idea that there should be a government official tasked with dealing with extremism. The word extremism has no objective meaning. It's no business of the government to define any opinion as extremism or to have people operating to try and stamp it out. If people commit crime, then they should be prosecuted for it and they should be punished if convicted. But the whole idea of a government having opinions on people's opinions is repulsive to me, and I'm amazed that we can sit here discussing it in a country that has until recently been reasonably free. It's simply not the job of the state to have any business interfering in what people think. What they do is another matter. As incitement to violence is another matter. But if we accept this, then it's not at all inconceivable that within not a very long time I could be classified as an extremist and subject to government investigation and supervision and who knows what else. I really am amazed at the way in which people give up the liberties which it took centuries in this country to obtain.
OK, well, let's let Louise Casey address that. I mean, is this a commission into looking into what people think, or is it about what they do?
Well, I'm not a government official
anymore. No, you're not, but we're discussing the appointment of one, aren't we?
And Sara Khan, to date, has not been a government official. I think it would be crazy to think that we don't have a problem in this country of the extreme far right getting more extreme, getting more members. It would be crazy to think that we don't have people in this country that right now, as we sit here, think that the young girls that died in the Manchester Arena bombing attack had it coming to them, that actually, you know, in the name of something, that actually that was an acceptable way, and people think
hang on,
that.
Acceptable?
And hang on,
let me because I don't know what you mean by acceptable.
Because one of the things that we do in all other areas of crime is that we prevent it. In all other areas of crime...
But we don't have laws about what people think in this country.
It's not laws about what people think, it's about kids growing up. What do you mean by acceptable, then? What I mean about acceptable is when, you know, there are young people that are growing up and actually start talking in classrooms and with their friends about things that we would find are very, very close to what is criminal. And if that was around, I mean, we're in at the moment some sort of constant furore over the boundaries between what's acceptable conduct for men in public life and in private life, and where they transgress those boundaries. I don't see anybody questioning that debate. Well, you might, Peter, but I don't see other people.
I question any
doing
menace
it.
to freedom of speech and thought, because these things were very dearly bought and they're very easily lost. And they're usually very easily lost on a strong emotional tide, such as the one which you've just been expressing, of how these people have disgusting opinions. I think a lot of people's opinions are disgusting, but I think they then must be challenged in open debate, that it is not the job of the state to prosecute people for what they think. We'll come to that, what they say, short of incitement. And although we do not have a First Amendment in this country, I think we should practice as far as possible the rules which follow from that. Which is, you can say what you like short of shouting fire in a crowded theatre, falsely. And I think we should stick to that. And I'm amazed at the way in which, particularly on the pretext of fighting terrorism, which actually the government isn't very good at, we introduce laws and procedures which are actually based on the idea that there are certain things you're not allowed to think.
OK, all right. Well, we understand what you think about that, Peter. Now, Louise, you were also director at the Home Office Antisocial Behaviour Unit, and we've got new crime statistics out today which show that violent crime and sex offences, as recorded by the police, have risen sharply. Robberies up by 29%, knife crime offences are up by 21%. The number of crimes recorded in that period up by 14% across 44 forces. This must be of concern to you.
Yes, I mean, I think since 2014 in particular, we've seen, and it's corroborated again today, a rise, particularly in knife crime. And those statistics are robust. So it's not about extra reporting or greater awareness. ONS are very clear that on that particular criminal offence that actually that's going in the wrong direction. And my own view, and Peter will probably disagree with this as well, is that I actually think it's time for us to step back and think, so what is happening? We know that this is a largely urban problem. It's a specific problem in London. If we ask the police which wards, they'd be able to tell us which wards. And I think the solution to it doesn't just lie in constant policing of it and enforcement. We do need enforcement and we do need policing. One of the things I'm worried about is the reduction of police officers and police resources, particularly into the Metropolitan Police. But nevertheless, we ought to know what is happening in those families and in their lives, why these kids are dropping out of school, why some of them think that actually carrying a knife is in their interest, in their safety, why we're allowing predatory, nasty gangs to take hold in some of these wards and not having a bigger response than actually we have at the moment. And there needs to be a line in the sand, and I don't see one. And I also think
police have said that knife crime is going to be a real a top issue for them. But actually, some more imaginative ideas, like the Violence Reduction Unit that operates in Glasgow, where you see knife crime rates falling substantially. Why are they not being adopted elsewhere?
Well, I think that there's just, well, apart from the fact I think that the Metropolitan Police are actually very concerned about resources in policing at the moment. I think the other thing is that we need to find what they've started in Scotland, and I saw your piece on Sunday and I was aware of that work in any event, but we need to find a different approach. And one of those different approaches is actually going into the families where we know that this is a problem and trying to work out how we can stop siblings and others growing up in those families making the same mistakes. And I think that's not a policing issue. That's where things like family intervention, which I did under Labour, troubled families, which I did under the Conservatives, needs to be at the forefront. You need a different approach to these things, and it is interference in terms of family life, because at the moment we have too many deaths and too many stabbings.
OK, well, let's bring Peter in. Is that too much state interference in family life?
No, the state is entitled to interfere when there is crime. That is exactly the point at which it is entitled to interfere. But what would seem to me to be a hugely unexamined aspect of this crime, though if you look into most of these cases you'll find it's present, is the increasing, almost epidemic use of mind-altering drugs in certain parts of our society, which the state does nothing whatever to prevent. The possession of drugs, and therefore their use, is now virtually unprosecuted in this country. A process which has been going on for 40 years, which has accelerated in recent years with the introduction, for instance, of the cannabis warning, which was effectively letting people off. And you also find this, I have to just mention, to go back to a subject we were discussing a minute or two ago, you almost always always find mind-altering drugs present in the lives of people who are involved in terrorist outrages, whether it would be marijuana, whether it be some prescription drugs, or whether it be steroids. They are almost invariably present. I've been studying this very carefully for some years, and they're there. And these are all a subset. These terrorist actions are a subset of violent crime, which is unusually closely studied. But the refusal of the authorities to deal with or attempt to interdict the possession and use of mind-altering drugs lies behind an awful lot of the crime increase we now face.
Is that fair criticism?
No, I don't agree with that, and I think that's part of the problem. Thank you. That's part of the problem with how this becomes a sort of left-right polarised debate. We know where the level of knife crime is very high. We know the wards in London in particular, probably Greater Manchester and Liverpool as well. We know that there are nasty predatory gangs that are at the top end of crime and they sweep people into it, quite often young people who have not got brilliant results in schools. Quite a lot of them are excluded, they're not in school, they're not in the same way. And it, underneath all of this involves a much more difficult conversation with ourselves about how we help those communities in a very significantly different way to the way we are at the moment. And if the statistics that are out today, particularly on knife crime, we need to stop this. It's somebody on the left saying it's an absolute outrage, and when Labour is in, somebody on the right would say it's an absolute outrage. We need to find a pragmatic way forward to the fact we have too many deaths of young men, in particular, on our streets in London and nationally.
Why won't you consider the drugs issue? You mentioned children in school dropping out, ask any teacher, and you'll find that in so many cases, particularly where they're bright, the point at which they drop out is the point at which they've started using drugs. The areas that you've named, where you say the knife crime comes from, are these areas that are free of drugs, that have no cannabis farms in them? They're pullulating with drugs.
OK, let Louise respond to that.
It's one of the issues that is at play. It's like one of the other jobs I've been responsible for is homelessness, where again drugs is a very, very prevalent part of what happens to people who are on the streets and in homelessness, as is use of alcohol. I'm not suggesting it's not an issue, of course I'm not, but that is not going to get the knife crime statistics and the lives of young people made safer in London and nationally if we just take one issue. We have to look at it in the round. And just finally, the more people that keep dissing prevent, the more actually people lose confidence in it. And so, the public who are not part of the counter-terrorism strategy, the more that people keep undermining it, the more difficult it is for the very police officers and the very civilians to do something about it. That's just an argument against free
discussion.
And prevent is a huge topic, but one we'll need to discuss at another time. Louise Casey, thank you very much for coming in. Now, a director at the Department for Education has resigned. The Families Minister was summoned to Downing Street to explain his presence at a charity event that was run by the President's Club at the Dorchester Hotel in London last week, where hostesses were reported to have been sexually harassed. Nadeem Zahawi said he left the event shortly after 9:30 when he felt uncomfortable, but he did not see, he said, any of the horrific events that were reported. He also tweeted that he would never attend a men-only function again. The government were asked to respond to an urgent question on the story in the Commons yesterday.
What the Department of Education needs to do, and in fact all government departments, all public bodies in fact, needs to do is to make sure that this sort of behaviour isn't going on anywhere. It has to not be tolerated. It's not just about forcing people to do the right thing. It's actually about changing attitudes.
I noticed that the organisation wishes to put it onto the individual members, where actually what happened was that women were bought as bait for men who are rich men, not a mile from where we stand, as if that is an acceptable behaviour. It is totally unacceptable.
It is appalling that that continues, and I support the Minister and her response, and we all have our duty to do to make sure that those dinners don't ever happen again.
They chose to treat the hostesses in this way, to make them parade across the stage in front of men, to make them wear black skimpy outfits and specify the colour of their underwear. They chose to ask them to drink before the event. Does she agree? All of the organisers, including the President's Club and all of the private companies involved in organising this, should be investigated for breach of the law and breach of the charity rules.
Cross-party is absolutely the word, and maybe that work starts from today.
Some men, especially rich and powerful men, feel entitled to women. They view their bodies as playthings, and they think that lecherous pawing and groping of women is acceptable behaviour. That a charity is prepared to facilitate that behaviour as long as wealthy men are opening their chequebooks beggars belief.
May I suggest to the Minister that this is more than a collective misjudgment, that this is a deliberate sticking up of two fingers to those that they perceive as being the PC culture.
So, pretty clear what MPs thought of the President's Club event. Peter Hitchens, are you as outraged as the MPs we heard there?
Well, I'm not surprised, but I am a Puritan and indeed perhaps a prude, and I find events of this kind as repulsive as anybody and more repulsive than some. What I'm interested to see now is that having long opposed the permissive society, of which this is an aspect, I now find I'm at last getting allies among the left-wing feminists who have always seemed to me to be at least equivocal about the permissive society and seen it as something in general good. I'm afraid this is a characteristic of it.
And it feels as though something fairly substantial has changed, because this may not have made the headlines it did yesterday if it had happened last year or 5 years ago.
Well, it's interesting to see the Financial Times entering scoop journalism, isn't it? But no, it wouldn't have done.
No, this follows on from Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too movement and all of this. Does it, though, mark a major cultural shift in which we are going to get very critical of all sorts of things that have been going on, maybe to the discomfort even of you?
I don't know. It seems to me to be possible. What's also possible is that it could just be another occasion for people to stand up in public and say how good they are. I was at the cinema at the weekend and I had to sit through a pre-film filmlet with all kinds of great and good persons saying they were against something like this, so that they were obviously nice. Well, sure, they can say that, but the question is, do they actually really oppose the changes in our society that have taken place over the past 40 or 50 years, which lead to it? We used to have actually a fairly stern morality about the treatment of women, but it was based very much on lifelong monogamous marriage and a general respect for chastity. Now we don't.
Well, and that was a very different society in many ways. Theresa May,
supposedly respectable people behaving in this way in a very, very expensive London hotel.
Theresa May in Davos has commented about this, and she says that she thought that kind of objectification of women in this case had been left behind. I mean, when she talks about that, it obviously hasn't, because we have lap dancing clubs all over the place, that Chippendale's performing, you name it, it's not just women, men as well.
Certainly used to give money to the Tory party. I don't know whether they still do, but I think they did.
Will we see a cultural shift against anything that can be regarded as objectification?
I don't know. Again, it would have to be enormously widespread to achieve it. I'm not sure quite how you can bring it to an end except with a major change in the moral climate. And what would that be? What is it that what I have to call, because there's no other term, the politically correct critics of this occasion, what is it that they would like to see in law and custom which would prevent this from happening in future?
All right. Well, now in the Commons this morning, the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson indicated that he will be asking for more money from the Chancellor as part of his defence review. His comments come amid widespread speculation about possible cuts to personnel and equipment and calls to increase defence spending to 3% of GDP from some MPs. But what about Trident, our nuclear missile deterrent, which will soon need replacing? Would the money spent on a replacement be better spent elsewhere? Well, here's our guest of the day, Peter Hitchens, on his soapbox.
Britain's defence policy is like a man who spends so much on insuring himself against alien abduction that he can't afford cover for fire and theft. Army chiefs have been warning this week that our conventional defences are frighteningly short of equipment, men and money. But what they won't say in public is that a major reason for the squeeze is the vast expense of building 4 new Trident submarines, Leviathans, hugely bigger than this 1960s relic HMS Ocelot, veteran of countless top-secret missions against the Soviet Union. Unlike Ocelot here, the new Trident boats are museum pieces before they've even been laid down. Like her, they're Cold War weapons, but built 30 years after the Cold War ended. Elaborate, complex and huge, they were designed to deter the enormous Soviet armies in East Germany, which long ago melted away. And they're a superpower weapon, decades after we ceased to be any such thing. If we were a superpower, we could make our own missiles rather than lease them from the USA, as we more or less do. Israel, a country with many irreconcilable enemies, and under far more risk of attack than we are, doesn't have anything like so elaborate or costly. So why should we? The choice isn't between Trident and nothing. The new submarines will come in at somewhere between £31 billion over 35 years, the government estimate, or £175 billion if you don't believe the government estimate, as I tend not to do. You can't help thinking that some of this money will come out of funds that could otherwise be spent on usable conventional weapons. The Tories and Labour Blairites think Trident is a very useful weapon with which to attack Jeremy Corbyn. But everyone in government knows that many in the military privately think it a vainglorious waste of money. Field Marshal Lord Bramall, too old to care what politicians say or do, openly says what many in the military can only think, that we should get rid of it. Nobody can call Lord Bramall a pacifist or a defeatist. He's living proof that there's a good, hard, patriotic argument for disposing of this unusable monstrosity before it destroys our real defences.
And we're joined in the studio now by the chair of the Defence Select Committee, Julian Lewis, and of course Peter Hitchens is still here. Thank you very much for coming in, Julian Lewis. What did you make of Peter Hitchens' argument there that basically the money that's being spent on Trident would be much better put to conventional weapons and building up the army?
Yes, well, unfortunately, we're nowhere near spending enough on defence, irrespective of the contribution that Trident's expenditure of 31 to 41 billion pounds spent over a considerable number of years would make any significant difference to. I always say to people who use this argument, if you think that you would scoop up the money that otherwise would be spent on our ultimate insurance policy against nuclear aggression, namely the Trident system, if you think more than a fraction of that would go back into defence, you're really being a little bit unrealistic. And in reality,
why? We have a commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence. That's yes. As part of our NATO membership. So surely the money from Trident would have to go back into defence spending.
The 2% commitment, this gets right to the heart of the issue. The 2% commitment is nowhere near enough. In the 10 long years of the Blair government, I was a shadow defence minister for the Conservatives, and I spent a lot of time arguing that they weren't spending enough when they were spending 2.5% of GDP, even when Peter's point, and it's a good point, that the Cold War came to an end at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. In the 1980s, we were spending 4.5% to 5% of GDP on defence. When it came to an end, we took the peace dividend cuts, and even years after we took the peace dividend cuts, do you know what we were spending in 1995 to 1996? Not barely 2% as at the moment. We were spending fully 3%. This would be a drop in the ocean and we'd be losing our ultimate insurance policy.
Peter?
Well, a lot of things are a drop in the ocean, if you like. The army just currently is suffering from a serious recruitment crisis, and one of the reasons for that, in my belief, is that it's closed down an awful lot of its recruitment offices. The cost of that is tiny, but it's the sort of cut which the Defence Ministry is constantly making. It's trivial in itself, but many of these things, the army itself, as you know, is now smaller than the army which Vichy France was permitted to have by Hitler after being defeated by Germany. It's so tiny that it barely counts as an army anymore. The Navy is in a terrible crisis because of of many things, not least the overspending on aircraft carriers that we can't use, and the fact that a lot of its ships don't work and can't move. But it also hasn't got enough people, and it's been losing over the years many valuable, experienced NCO type people of the kind you can't easily replace. And these are not particularly expensive things, but the drain of money into Trident is one of the main reasons why these things are happening and will continue to happen for 30 years to come. Now the question is, do we need this thing? And also, I think it's all part of the process of national growing up. We really do need to understand that we are an important country, but we're not a superpower, and that we should start behaving as one and getting rid of this thing. And when we've got the chance to pull out of it before renewing it at vast expense would be a very useful moment of recognition of what we really need to be. We actually need to sit down and say, what do we need an army for? What do we need a navy for? What do we need an air force for? And what shape should they have? But that needs a moment of profound reflection and saying we're not a superpower anymore, and the Cold War is actually over would be a good starting point for that discussion. It would also save significant amounts of money. Sure, we could spend more, but within what we do spend, transferring the money that we spend on this to conventional defence would be a sensible move.
Well, can I just say, we were not a superpower at any stage during the Cold War. But during the Cold War, we spent regularly 5% of GDP on defence.
Peter's point is not just about the spending. He's suggesting that the nuclear weapons are a status symbol for the United Kingdom.
Well, this leads me to the second half of the argument, providing I have sufficiently managed to establish, as I hope I have, that our defence spending is so woefully low that until we get to the point where we've got a defence secretary, and we might just have one now, who is prepared to say that we need to be spending more of the order of 3% of GDP, this sort of argument is going to make no realistic difference. And do you know what? Michael Fallon, who defended the government line through all his years as Secretary of State for Defence, now he isn't Secretary of State for Defence, has an article in the Daily Telegraph saying, do you know what? We need to be spending at least 2.5% of GDP. So I think we're winning that argument, Peter. Let's not divert onto Trident for the money point of view. The argument about why we need Trident is simple. Trident has never been to deter the major armies of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Trident is to ensure that no country can ever be misled into thinking that it could blackmail us into surrender by the threat of using nuclear weapons against us, which we would have no means of retaliating for. And even one Trident submarine is able to inflict such damage in retaliation. Not only is it unacceptable, it is unavoidable. It is not a panacea. It does not meet other forms of military threat. I'll just finish the sentence, if I may, Peter. It does not deter every form of military threat. What it does do is deter the one form of threat, which is nuclear attack, without which, a defence without which you would be incapable of defending yourself, no matter how strong your conventional forces are.
Let Peter respond.
Well, as you well know, British nuclear weapons were originally developed because we were annoyed by the Americans. Ernest Bevin came out of a meeting with James Burns, the then Secretary of State, so furious at the way he'd been treated that he said, we are going to build our own nuclear bombs, come what may. And a lot of the building of and the testing of British nuclear weapons in the 1950s was specifically for that purpose, to demonstrate we were still important. Then we became, because of the failure of Blue Streak and the cancellation of Blue Steel, dependent upon the Americans for our missiles. Then it became an issue of whether we could destroy Moscow.
Okay.
And Trident, the reason for the development first of Cheveline and then of Trident was so we could continue to be able to destroy Moscow. And the reason for these incredibly expensive submarines is to try and evade the Soviet Navy.
Okay.
These issues simply do not exist anymore.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Julian Lewis for coming in to talk about that. There is just time now before we go to find out the answer to the quiz. The question was, which world-famous politician did Donald Trump say Theresa May could be like? Was it A. Winston Churchill, B. Margaret Thatcher, C. Ronald Reagan, or D. Neville Chamberlain? So, Peter, what is the correct answer?
I don't know, but when people are being rude to other politicians, they usually say they're Neville Chamberlain. But usually the people who say that imagine that they're Winston Churchill.
Well, apparently it was Winston Churchill that he told her on the phone she could be like.
He thought she was like Winston Churchill.
He just watched a film and said that Theresa May had the possibility to become like him. That's all for today. Thank you to all of our guests. The 1 o'clock news is just starting over on BBC One now. Bye-bye.